They said it couldn't be solved from the air. By 1943, German U-boats had turned the North Atlantic into a graveyard for Allied shipping. The Navy had radar-equipped aircraft built to hunt them from above, but the U-boats had a lookout with a pair of binoculars. A patrol plane, dark against a bright sky, could be spotted 12 miles out. By the time it closed the distance, the submarine had already crash-dived. Gone. Unreachable. Radar could find them. Nothing could get close enough to kill them. Some engineers pushed for better concealment, darker paint, duller finishes. One team at the Navy's research division argued the opposite. Stop hiding the aircraft in shadow. Make it glow exactly as bright as the sky behind it. In late 1943, a modified Grumman TBF Avenger took off from a Navy test station on the Atlantic coast, its nose and wings lined with lamps that weren't there to help the pilot see. They were there to make the enemy blind, and the numbers that came back from that flight would decide whether the idea was madness or the answer no one else had tried. The numbers, when they finally came in, would surprise almost everyone who doubted the idea. But to understand why the U.S. Navy was willing to bolt light bulbs onto a warplane in the middle of a global war, you have to go back 2 years earlier, to the ocean this aircraft was built to fight over. By the winter of 1942 into 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had become the war's longest, grimmest campaign, and the one both sides understood could decide everything else. Britain could not feed itself, fuel itself, or arm itself without convoys crossing from North America. Germany knew it. Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat fleet had spent the war's first years proving it, hunting merchant ships in coordinated wolf packs that struck at night and vanished before escorts could respond. Tonnage sunk was measured not in single ships, but in entire convoys gutted in a single crossing. Steel, fuel, food, and the men who sailed with them, gone to the bottom faster than American and British shipyards could replace them. The stakes behind those numbers were not abstract. Every convoy that made it across the Atlantic carried the raw material of the entire war effort in the European theater: aviation fuel, for bombers that would never fly without it, wheat for a British population already living on ration books, steel and machine tools that would become the next generation of tanks and aircraft. Wolfpack tactics made the threat worse than a simple numbers game. U-boats didn't attack alone. They gathered in loose formations along a convoy's projected track, shadowing at a distance during daylight, and closing in together after dark. When a single submarine's periscope was hardest to spot, and a coordinated multi-boat attack could overwhelm an escort screen built to handle isolated threats. A convoy that lost a third of its ships in one crossing wasn't a setback that could simply be absorbed and rebuilt from. It was months of lost capacity, rippling forward into every campaign that depended on what those ships had been carrying. The Allies had one advantage the U-boats couldn't outbuild: the sky. Long-range aircraft, flying far out over the mid-Atlantic gap that surface escorts couldn't reach, carried something the U-boats feared more than any destroyer airborne radar. A Liberator or a Catalina sweeping a patrol line could find a surfaced submarine through cloud, through darkness, through the empty gray nothing of open ocean, in a way no lookout on a Corvette ever could. On paper, this should have ended the U-boat's daylight freedom entirely. A submarine ran faster on the surface than submerged, needed the surface to recharge its batteries and refresh its air, and was desperately vulnerable the moment it was caught there. But radar could only tell a crew where to look. It could not close the distance for them. And in the seconds that mattered, the seconds after a U-boat's own lookouts realized they'd been found, geometry took over, and geometry favored the submarine. A German U-boat could crash dive from full surface running to safely submerged in under a minute. Once under, radar was blind again. The aircraft's sensor advantage evaporated the instant the target dropped beneath the waves. So the entire value of a radar contact rested on one brutal requirement. The aircraft had to close the distance and drop its depth charges before the crew below could react. Every second the submarine had warning was a second closer to escape. And here was the problem no radar set could fix. Once an aircraft closed to visual range, it was the U-boat's watch, not its instruments, that decided the outcome. A surface submarine typically kept 3 lookouts on deck, each one scanning an assigned arc of sky and horizon, trained specifically to catch the one shape that mattered, a dark silhouette against bright cloud. And they were good at it. Painfully good. Documented test conditions from the period found that an unmodified patrol aircraft, painted in standard Navy gray, doing everything doctrine said an anti-submarine aircraft should do, could be picked out by the naked eye from as far as 12 miles away. 12 miles was nothing to a radar set. 12 miles was an eternity to a crash-diving crew. By the time the aircraft crossed that distance, throttled up, dropped altitude, and lined up its attack run, the submarine the radar had found was already gone. Hull cooling somewhere beneath the swell, leaving nothing behind but an empty patch of ocean and a wasted radar contact. This was the arithmetic. The U.S. Navy's anti-submarine campaign kept running into by 1943, and it was costing convoy ships. Radar had solved detection. It had done nothing for the final mile. Somewhere between "we found the U-boat" and "we sank the U-boat" sat a gap that no amount of additional radar power, no faster engine, no heavier depth charge load could close, because the gap wasn't technical, it was visual. As long as a patrol aircraft looked, from a distance, like a dark object moving against a bright sky, the U-boat's oldest and simplest defense, a sharp-eyed sailor with binoculars, would keep working exactly as it had since the first submarine ever put a man on watch. Naval planners understood this well enough to have already tried the obvious fixes and watched them fall short. Standard anti-submarine gray was already about as close to sky matching as a fixed paint scheme could get, chosen specifically to reduce contrast under average daylight conditions. It helped, but only within limits a fixed color could never escape. The sky itself doesn't hold still. It brightens toward a clear noon and dims toward an overcast dusk, shifts from the pale blue of a cloudless morning to the flat gray-white of a North Atlantic squall line, sometimes within the length of a single patrol sortie. A paint scheme tuned to one of those conditions was necessarily wrong for the others. What the Navy actually needed wasn't a better color. It needed an aircraft that could change its own brightness in real time, matching whatever sky happened to be behind it at that exact moment. A machine that behaved less like a paint job and more like a living thing, adjusting to its surroundings. In 1943, nothing in naval aviation worked that way. Nothing, until an idea that had started with a Canadian professor and a snow-covered airfield finally found its way to the engineers who needed it most. Fixing that gap meant answering a question that had nothing to do with sensors, weapons, or engines, and everything to do with a much older science. How the human eye actually perceives a dark shape against a bright field, and whether that perception could be defeated on purpose. The Navy didn't have an obvious answer, but by the time this story reaches its test flight, they'd found one, and it hadn't come from an aircraft engineer at all. It had come from a professor watching a plane disappear over snow. That professor's name was Edmund Godfrey Burr, and in December 1940, a full year before the United States had even entered the war, he was not thinking about submarines at all. Burr taught at McGill University in Montreal, and Canada's National Research Council had assigned him a narrow, technical problem. Evaluate night observation instruments. The device is meant to help spotters pick out aircraft in darkness. It was routine work, methodical and unglamorous, the kind of wartime research that rarely produces a breakthrough. Burr had already noted something that seemed obvious once you thought about it, that even an aircraft painted flat black, flying with every light off, still stood out against a night sky, because the sky itself was never truly black. There was always some residual glow, some faint difference in brightness between the aircraft's silhouette and the air behind it, and the eye was extraordinarily good at catching exactly that kind of difference. Then, one evening that December, Burr was watching a plane come in to land over snow-covered ground when it did something that should not have been possible. It vanished. Not behind cloud, not into darkness. It simply stopped being visible, mid-approach, in conditions where it had no business disappearing. Burr worked out what had happened almost immediately, because it was the same principle he'd already been circling in his own research. Light reflected up off the snow below had struck the aircraft's underside at just the right intensity to cancel out the brightness difference between the plane and the sky behind it. For one accidental moment, the aircraft's luminance matched its background so precisely that Burr's eye-trained, professional, specifically looking for aircraft, simply failed to register it as a separate object at all. It's a reasonable inference that Burr recognized immediately what he was looking at, not a curiosity, but a mechanism. If reflected light from snow could erase an aircraft by accident, deliberately controlled light might be able to erase one on purpose, anywhere, without needing snow at all. Burr took the observation to Canada's National Research Council, who passed it to the Royal Canadian Navy, and the idea moved quickly from theory to hardware, though not, at first, for aircraft. The Navy's early trials fitted the technique to warships instead, mounting ordinary light projectors on the hulls of corvettes and pointing them inward at the ship's own sides, adjusting brightness by hand to match the sky. Sea trials on HMCS Cobalt in January 1941, then a refined version on HMCS Chambly that spring, proved the underlying physics worked. A ship, lit correctly, really could blend into a bright horizon in a way flat gray paint never could. The Royal Navy ran parallel trials of its own and found the same thing. Word reached the very top. The British Admiralty briefed Winston Churchill on the results, and Churchill, never a man to let a good idea move slowly, reportedly pushed for it to be tested more broadly than a single ship. But the Canadian shipboard system had real limits. The projectors were heavy, fragile, and exposed to weather, and brightness had to be adjusted manually by a crewman watching the sky workable on a ship with room to spare, useless on an aircraft where every extra pound and every moment of pilot distraction mattered. Neither the Canadian nor British navies pushed the shipboard version into full production. For a while, the idea that had started with a professor and a vanishing airplane looked like it might end there too, an interesting physics demonstration with no practical home. It found one in the United States. As American entry into the war brought the U.S. Navy fully into the North Atlantic fight, the country's National Defense Research Committee, the NDRC, the same wartime body, responsible for coordinating much of America's civilian scientists' contribution to the war effort, under the direction of engineer and administrator Vannevar Bush, took an interest in the Canadian work. The NDRC's camouflage section saw immediately what Burr's Canadian Navy colleagues hadn't had the platform to pursue. If counter-illumination could hide a ship, in principle, it could hide something. The U-boats feared even more the aircraft coming to sink them. The U.S. Army Air Force's Director of Technical Services formally handed the NDRC a specific, narrow assignment, phrased with the exact precision that only a wartime research program could produce. Find a way to let a radar-equipped, sea-search aircraft approach a surface submarine to within 30 seconds of flying time before the crew below could see it coming. 30 seconds wasn't a nice-to-have. It was the calculated margin the Navy believed it needed just enough time to close for an attack before a U-boat could complete its crash dive. This was, in its way, a very ordinary kind of assignment for the NDRC to receive, even if the solution it eventually produced was anything but ordinary. Bush's committee had spent the war acting as a kind of clearinghouse between civilian science and military need, pulling university researchers, private sector engineers, and government laboratories into direct, fast-moving collaboration with the armed forces on problems that ranged from radar development to synthetic materials to, now, the specific physics of how a human eye fails to notice a correctly lit airplane. The camouflage section itself was a relatively small piece of that much larger machine, but it had exactly the kind of mandate this problem needed: authority to pull in outside expertise, funding to build real test hardware, rather than just publish a paper, and critically, the standing to take an idea that had already been quietly shelved by two different Allied navies and give it one more serious look. That look started with the Canadian file. When the NDRC's camouflage section reviewed the Cobalt and Chambly results, what they saw wasn't a failed program. They saw a program that had proven the physics and then run out of the right platform to prove it on. A ship's hull, covered in exposed projectors and adjusted by hand, was never going to be practical at any scale. An aircraft was a different problem, entirely smaller area to illuminate, a single approach vector to defend rather than every angle around a hull, and, if the control could be automated rather than left to a sailor's judgment, none of the human response time weakness that had limited the shipboard version. It's a reasonable inference that this reframing, not a new discovery, but a better platform for an already proven idea, is what convinced the NDRC the concept was worth pursuing seriously, rather than filing alongside the Canadian Navy's own shelved research. The NDRC's engineers took Burr's snow and sunlight accident and turned it into an engineering brief. They gave it a name that, depending on who you ask, was either an inside joke or a small tribute. Yehudi reportedly borrowed from the celebrity violinist Yehudi Menuhin, whose name had become wartime slang shorthand for something unseen and mysterious, a little man who wasn't there. Whatever the reason for the name, the assignment behind it was deadly serious. And the team now tasked with solving it were about to discover that turning a professor's accidental observation into a working aircraft system was a far harder problem than anyone in that first meeting expected. The physics, on paper, was almost embarrassingly simple. The engineering was not. What the NDRC needed to build was a system that could measure the brightness of the sky behind an aircraft in real time, then instantly adjust a set of lamps on that aircraft to match it not roughly, not close enough, but precisely enough to fool a trained human eye, scanning specifically for exactly this kind of mismatch. The solution the engineers settled on used a pair of photocells wired into a balancing circuit. One photocell aimed outward at the open sky, sampling its true brightness moment to moment as clouds thickened or thinned or the sun shifted. The other aimed at a small auxiliary reference lamp. The circuit's entire job was to keep the output of those two photocells equal, constantly adjusting the brightness of the aircraft's main lamps so the plane's glow tracked the sky's glow automatically, without a crewman touching a dial. It was, in effect, a machine built to erase a very specific kind of shadow, correcting itself dozens of times a minute faster than any human operator ever could. Where to put the lamps mattered just as much as how to control them. Early British research into a similar concept had already ruled out lighting. The entire underside of an aircraft, the power draw required to illuminate a whole fuselage in daylight, was far beyond what any aircraft's electrical system could reasonably supply, and external light projectors bolted to the skin caused exactly the kind of aerodynamic drag no operational bomber could afford. The American approach solved both problems with the same idea Burr had implicitly pointed to back in 1940. You don't need to light the whole aircraft. You only need to change what a distant observer's eye actually perceives, and a distant eye is remarkably insensitive to where light comes from, as long as it arrives from roughly the right direction. So the NDRC's engineers mounted their lamps facing forward, ringed around the nose, lined along the leading edges of the wings, some suspended beneath the wing itself, all aimed directly at the observer rather than at the aircraft's own skin. It was less like painting the plane and more like the aircraft was quietly generating its own patch of sky and holding it up in front of itself. The effect had more in common with certain deep-sea squid, which use rows of light-producing organs on their undersides to cancel their own silhouette against sunlight filtering down from the surface, than with any camouflage paint scheme the Navy had used before. Before anyone was willing to risk a real aircraft, the NDRC tested the concept the way any cautious engineering program does, with a mock-up. Technicians built a full-scale plywood model of a B-24 Liberator, wired it with lights, and suspended it from cables for observers to study from a distance. What they reported back was almost comic in how well it worked. Viewers could see the cables holding the model in the air. They could not see the model itself. A wooden shape the size of a heavy bomber, hanging in plain daylight, had effectively disappeared, defeated by nothing more than correctly calibrated light. It's worth pausing on just how strange that mock-up test must have looked from the ground. A wooden airframe the size of a 4-engine bomber, hanging motionless in daylight from cables anchored to whatever rigging the test team had built to suspend it, lit only by the photocell-controlled lamps wired into its nose and wings, and observers standing at a measured distance, squinting, adjusting focus, reporting back that they could trace the exact lines of the support cables running up into empty air, but could not find the object those cables were supposedly holding. For engineers who had spent months translating a professor's snowfield accident into circuit diagrams and lamp specifications, that report must have felt like the moment the theory stopped being theory. That result was enough to greenlight real aircraft. The NDRC moved the system onto an actual B-24 Liberator designated within the project as AC-45, fitting it with as many as 40 individual lamps across the nose and wings, tied into the photocell control circuit. By late 1943, this modified Liberator was flying real test sorties, the first time the Yehudi concept had left the laboratory and a wooden mock-up and taken to the air as a functioning aircraft system. Soon after, the Navy extended the program to a smaller, more tactically relevant airframe, the Grumman TBM Avenger, the torpedo bomber that made up the backbone of the fleet's carrier-based anti-submarine squadrons. The Avenger's smaller wing and shorter nose meant the lamp layout had to be rethought, rather than simply copied from the Liberator fewer lamps, more tightly clustered around the engine cowling and wing leading edges, but the underlying photocell balancing system carried over largely unchanged. There was, however, a catch buried inside the engineering that no amount of clever circuitry could fully solve, and it would shadow the entire project through every test that followed. The system only worked if the aircraft's nose stayed pointed within roughly 3 degrees of the observer it was trying to fool. Aim the plane's forward-facing lamps even slightly off that narrow cone, and the illusion collapsed. The observer would simply be looking past the light rather than into it, and the aircraft's dark silhouette would reappear exactly as if the lamps weren't there at all. For a straight, level anti-submarine approach, aimed directly at a surfaced U-boat dead ahead, this tolerance was workable. For anything involving a turn, a crosswind correction, or an evasive maneuver, it was a hard physical limit the crew had to fly around, not through. There was a second, quieter constraint sitting alongside the angular tolerance, one that mattered just as much to whether this system could ever be more than a research curiosity: weight and power. Every lamp added to an airframe was weight that could otherwise have been fuel, ammunition, or armor, and every lamp needed current from an electrical system that already had radar sets, radios, and gun turrets drawing against the same limited supply. British researchers had already ruled out lighting an entire aircraft skin for exactly this reason. The power draw simply wasn't survivable within a combat aircraft's existing electrical budget. The NDRC's forward-facing, edge-mounted approach sidestepped the worst of that problem by lighting a much smaller effective area than a full-skin system would have needed. But it didn't eliminate the trade-off entirely. Every version of the system the engineers built was, in effect, a negotiation between 3 competing demands: enough lamps to convincingly match the sky, low enough total power draw to leave the aircraft's other systems undisturbed, and light enough total weight to avoid meaningfully hurting the aircraft's range or maneuverability, and getting that balance wrong in either direction would have made the system operationally useless, even if the underlying physics worked perfectly. The engineers understood all of this going in. What they didn't yet know, what no plywood mock-up and no laboratory photocell bench could tell them, was how the system would hold up against real weather, real distances, and real observers who had no idea what they were about to be tested against. That question could only be answered in the air, over open water, against people who were trying, as hard as any human being can try, to see the airplane coming for them. Through 1944 and into the first months of 1945, the Yehudi-equipped aircraft flew a long, patient series of test sorties, not one dramatic, proof-of-concept flight, but dozens of them, in different weather, at different ranges, altitudes, and approach angles, with observers stationed on land and aboard surface vessels to record exactly what they could and couldn't see. For the flight crews assigned to this program, the work must have felt strange, in a way few other wartime assignments did. There was no enemy to engage, no cargo to deliver, no formation to hold. Just the same approach, flown again and again, toward the same stretch of ocean, with a photocell circuit humming somewhere behind the instrument panel, and a crew of observers on the surface below whose only job was to try, as hard as they could, to see the aircraft coming. It's a reasonable inference that flying test after test toward people specifically trying to spot you carried its own quiet pressure, a kind of inverted combat stress, not the fear of being seen too late, but the discipline of holding a precise heading and airspeed for the sake of a number on someone else's clipboard, run after run, in weather that rarely cooperated twice in a row. This was where the project's neat laboratory physics met the much messier physics of the real Atlantic sky. A photocell system tuned to balance brightness against a clear, evenly lit horizon behaved differently under a scattered cloud deck, differently again in the flat, diffuse light of an overcast afternoon, and differently still in the last hour before sunset, when the sky's color and brightness could shift meaningfully in the time it took an aircraft to complete a single approach run. Records from the period describe test after test logged specifically to map these edge cases, how the system performed against a hazy horizon, against a sky with scattered cumulus, at oblique angles where the aircraft wasn't flying directly at the observer. The engineers weren't chasing one perfect demonstration. They were building a working understanding of exactly where the illusion held and exactly where it broke down, because an anti-submarine crew flying this in earnest would need to know both. Some of what they found confirmed the concept outright. Under favorable conditions, a reasonably even sky, the aircraft, holding close to that critical head-on approach angle. The lamps did precisely what Burr's accidental snowlit airplane had done back in 1940. They erased the aircraft's silhouette almost entirely, leaving observers straining to pick out a shape that, moments before the lights came on, had been plainly, unmistakably visible. Other findings were more sobering, and they mattered just as much. The 3-degree tolerance the engineers had flagged as a design constraint turned out, in practice, to be exactly as unforgiving as feared. A pilot correcting for crosswind drift, or beginning a turn to line up an attack run, could drift the aircraft's nose just far enough off-axis to break the illusion mid-approach, and because the system depended entirely on the observer's angle to the aircraft, there was no way for the crew in the cockpit to know, in real time, whether the lights were still working from the U-boat's point of view. They could fly the aircraft correctly and still lose the camouflage without any indication in the cockpit that anything had changed. Weather added a second layer of uncertainty. A shift in cloud cover partway through an approach could change the sky's brightness faster than the balancing circuit's reference photocell could reliably track it, particularly in the scattered, uneven lighting conditions common over open ocean rather than the controlled test range skies where the balancing circuit had first been calibrated. None of this meant the concept had failed. It meant the team was doing exactly what a serious flight test program is supposed to do, finding the real operating envelope of a new system rather than assuming the laboratory result would simply transfer intact to open water. Engineers adjusted photocell sensitivity, refined lamp placement on the Avenger's smaller airframe, and narrowed in on the specific approach profile, altitude, speed, and heading that kept the aircraft inside its 3-degree window for as long as possible during a realistic attack run. It was unglamorous, iterative work, the kind that produces no dramatic single moment worth filming, only a slow tightening of numbers across dozens of flights. By early 1945, that tightening had produced a test aircraft and a test protocol the NDRC team believed were finally ready for the result that mattered most. Not, can this work under ideal conditions, which the plywood mock-up had already answered, but what is the actual distance at which a trained observer, specifically looking for this aircraft, can detect it under realistic operating conditions, compared to an identical aircraft with the lights switched off. That comparison camouflaged against uncamouflaged, same day, same sky, same observers was the test that would either justify 2 years of work or quietly end it. It was flown that spring, off the Atlantic coast, with a modified TBM Avenger and a second, unmodified aircraft flying alongside it as the control. Getting to that point had cost the program more than a year of unglamorous refinement. And it's worth naming what that refinement actually looked like, because it's the part every dramatized account of a secret weapon tends to skip past. It wasn't one flash of insight. It was engineers logging observer reports after every sortie, noting the exact cloud conditions, the exact approach heading, the exact moment the aircraft stopped being invisible and became visible again, then adjusting photocell sensitivity by some small margin, and flying the same profile the next clear day to see if the adjustment had helped or made things worse. Some changes helped immediately. Others made the system oversensitive, causing the lamps to flicker or overcorrect, as the reference photocell reacted to momentary shifts in light that a human eye would have simply ignored. Each failed adjustment was itself useful data, narrowing the range of conditions the final system needed to handle well rather than trying, impossibly, to handle every condition equally. What came back from that flight was the number the entire project had been built to produce. The test was designed to be as fair and as unforgiving as the NDRC could make it. 2 aircraft, near identical, but for one detail. Only one of them had its Yehudi lights switched on. Observers on the surface, briefed to watch for exactly this kind of approach, tracked both aircraft as they closed the distance under matching conditions, same sky, same lighting, same general bearing. There was no ambiguity built into the comparison. Whatever difference showed up between the 2 aircraft would be the lights, and nothing else. The unmodified aircraft behaved exactly as 2 years of prior testing, and, more importantly, 2 years of real Atlantic combat experience had already established. Observers picked it out at roughly 12 miles, the same rough distance that had defined the entire problem this project existed to solve. A dark shape against a bright sky, spotted early, spotted easily, giving a U-boat's lookouts all the warning they needed to begin a crash dive long before any attack run could begin. The Yehudi-equipped Avenger did something else. Flying the same approach, under the same sky, its lamps balancing against the horizon exactly as the photocell circuit was designed to do. It closed the distance far past the point where the unmodified aircraft had already been spotted past 10 miles, past 5, continuing in until it had closed to roughly 3,000 yards from the observing ship before it was finally, definitively seen. 3,000 yards. Under the same conditions that had revealed its twin at 12 miles out, it's worth sitting with what that gap actually meant, because the raw distance understates it. 12 miles to 3,000 yards isn't a modest improvement. It's close to a 20-fold reduction in the range at which the aircraft became visible. For a naval engineering program, a result like that doesn't usually arrive all at once. More often, it arrives as a slow accumulation of smaller gains. A slightly better photocell here, a tighter approach heading there that only reveals its full size once someone adds up the final comparison. This time, the comparison spoke for itself the moment the two aircraft were logged side by side. Translated into the terms that actually mattered to a U-boat crew, it meant the difference between minutes of warning and none at all. The entire operational target the Army Air Forces had handed the NDRC at the start of this project get a sea search aircraft within 30 seconds of flying time before the crew below could see it wasn't just met. By these numbers, it was comfortably exceeded. A submarine that had grown used to spotting a patrol aircraft with time to calmly initiate a crash dive would, against this modified Avenger, likely see nothing at all until the aircraft was already committed to its attack run, far too close for the dive cycle to save them. The test team went further, working out exactly why the U-boat's traditional defense 3 lookouts, each covering a wide arc with the naked eye or with binoculars, struggled so badly against this specific kind of camouflage. Standard 8-power binoculars of the era offered a field of view of only about 5 degrees, a narrow window that worked well for confirming a target. A lookout's unaided eye had already flagged, but was nearly useless for independently scanning wide stretches of open sky. A U-boat crew relying on binoculars alone to catch a camouflaged aircraft would effectively need to keep them raised and sweeping constantly across their full assigned arc, which no watch schedule could sustain for hours at a time without exhausting the crew. The analysis pointed to an uncomfortable choice for any submarine trying to counter this new threat. Either give up radar silence entirely, which made the U-boat far easier to locate by other means, even if harder to visually surprise or commit lookouts to a level of continuous, binocular-aided scanning that was, in practical terms, unsustainable. There was a broader operational implication in the result too, one that went beyond any single attack run. An anti-submarine aircraft that could close to 3,000 yards unseen wasn't just harder to spot, it fundamentally changed the tactical relationship between hunter and hunted. A U-boat crew that had grown accustomed to 12 miles of warning had built their entire daylight routine around that margin. How often to send a lookout below to rest, how long to stay surfaced running batteries, how much risk to accept before diving preemptively at the first hint of an aircraft on the horizon. Strip away most of that warning distance, and every one of those routine calculations became far more dangerous to get wrong. Even U-boats that were never actually caught by a Yehudi-equipped aircraft would, in a world where the system had gone into wide service, have had to operate as though any approaching aircraft might be one surfacing less, diving sooner, trusting radar warning receivers more than their own lookouts. The psychological value of an unproven threat, in other words, could have mattered nearly as much as the mechanical one. For a research program that had spent 2 years chasing a number, this was as close to unambiguous vindication as engineering testing ever produces. The physics Burr had stumbled onto by accident over snow-covered ground in 1940 had been deliberately engineered, tuned, and proven, under conditions built specifically to be hard to fool, against a target profile human observers scanning for aircraft that had been doing exactly this job, successfully, since the earliest days of the U-boat war. Project Yehudi had done what it was built to do. It had made an American warplane, for all practical purposes, invisible until it was already too close to escape. It's a reasonable inference that this result, when it reached the NDRC's leadership and the Navy officers who'd greenlit the program, landed as genuine vindication 2 years of unglamorous photocell tuning and weather-dependent test flights, finally producing the exact number the project had been chasing since its first assignment memo. What none of them could have fully appreciated in that moment was how little time the result would have to matter. The war Project Yehudi had been built to fight was already changing underneath it, and the change had nothing to do with light. Through 1943 and into 1944, Allied anti-submarine forces had been steadily fielding a technology that solved the U-boat problem from an entirely different direction: centimeter wave radar. Earlier airborne radar sets, working on longer wavelengths, had real limitations. They struggled to distinguish a small surface submarine from background sea clutter at longer ranges, and German radar detection equipment had, for a period, been able to pick up the aircraft's own radar transmissions and give U-boat crews early warning to dive before the aircraft ever got close. That earlier radar detection gear had itself been a hard-won German countermeasure, born out of exactly the same escalating back and forth that had produced Project Yehudi on the Allied side. Every advantage one side found, the other eventually found a way to blunt. Centimeter wave sets changed both sides of that equation. They offered sharper resolution, better discrimination against sea clutter, and crucially, their shorter wavelengths were largely invisible to the German radar detection gear that had been giving U-boats advance warning. For the first time, Allied aircraft could find a surfaced submarine on radar with real confidence, and do it without tipping their hand. It was, in its own way, a solution to almost the same problem. Project Yehudi had been built to solve a way to close the gap between finding a U-boat and catching it before it dove, but arrived at from the sensor side of the equation rather than the camouflage side. Both approaches were chasing the same 30-second margin. Radar simply got there through detection technology that scaled far more easily across an entire patrol fleet than a lamp system requiring precise angular alignment ever could. The consequence for U-boat crews was blunt and immediate. Surfacing in daylight, anywhere within range of Allied air patrols, became close to suicidal, regardless of how well an approaching aircraft was camouflaged. It didn't matter whether a patrol plane could close to 3,000 yards unseen if the submarine's own crew had already concluded that surfacing at all, in daylight, in contested waters, was no longer survivable. Commanders adapted the only way they could. U-boats increasingly stayed submerged through daylight hours, surfacing under cover of darkness to recharge batteries and refresh air, then diving again before dawn. The entire tactical scenario, Project Yehudi, had been engineered to solve a daylight visual duel between an approaching aircraft and a surfaced submarine's lookouts, was quietly ceasing to happen at all, not because the Yehudi system had failed, but because the enemy had stopped presenting the target it was built to defeat. This is the part of the story that has no dramatic turning point, no single decision that closed the program, and that's exactly what makes it worth sitting with. Project Yehudi wasn't canceled because it didn't work. The test data from that spring 1945 flight proved, about as definitively as a wartime test program ever proves anything, that it worked extremely well. It was set aside because the war around it had moved on to a different problem, and a camouflage system built to win a visual encounter mattered less and less in a war where that visual encounter was increasingly rare to begin with. By early 1945, with Germany's surrender only months away, and centimeter wave radar already doing the job Yehudi had been built to support, the Navy quietly stood the program down. No further aircraft were converted. The plywood B-24 mock-up, the modified Liberator, and the Avenger that had made its run to 3,000 yards were the only airframes the concept ever flew on. There's a particular kind of ending buried in that outcome, one this channel keeps returning to for a reason. Project Yehudi didn't fail. It simply stopped being needed, at almost the exact moment it had finally proven itself. 2 years of a professor's accidental observation, a Canadian Corvette experiment, an NDRC engineering assignment, dozens of test flights through 1,944's uncertain weather, and one definitive spring, 1,945 result that beat its own target by a wide margin. All of it arrived just in time to matter to almost no one, because the U-boats it was designed to catch had, by then, largely stopped giving anyone the chance. What happened to the program's records afterward tells its own quiet story. The engineering, the test data, the full account of what the Navy had built and proven went into the archive rather than into production, and stayed there, officially unacknowledged, for decades. It would be the better part of 40 years before the details of Project Yehudi were declassified and became available for anyone outside the program to study. For most of that time, the aircraft that had learned to disappear against the sky simply didn't exist, as far as the public record was concerned. Some stories don't get erased by accident. This one was filed away on purpose, its success quietly outpaced by a war that had already moved to the next problem. There's something worth noting about what declassification eventually revealed, once it finally happened decades later. The program hadn't been buried out of embarrassment. The surviving records, engineering reports, test logs, the same kind of methodical data that had guided every photocell adjustment through 1944, describe a project that did exactly what it was designed to do, then stopped mattering through no fault of its own. That's a less dramatic story than a cover-up or a failure, and maybe that's part of why it took so long to surface. There was no scandal to eventually leak, no whistleblower with a reason to come forward, just a technically successful program that the Navy filed away because the war had already answered the question a different way. Quiet successes, it turns out, can disappear from public memory, just as completely as outright failures, sometimes more completely, because there's no controversy attached to keep anyone asking questions about them. It would take another conflict, on the other side of the world, for the Navy's idea to be tested in the air again. By 1973, the war had changed shape entirely, and so had the aircraft flying it. The North Atlantic's slow-moving submarine hunt had given way to Vietnam's high-speed jet combat, where an F-4 Phantom didn't need to sneak up on a surfaced U-boat. It needed to avoid being visually acquired by enemy fighters and ground observers in the split seconds that decided a dogfight or a strike run. The specific tactical problem was different. The underlying physics Edmund Burr had noticed 33 years earlier, watching a plane vanish over snow, hadn't changed at all. The U.S. Air Force revived the concept under a new name, Compass Ghost, and fitted a test F-4 Phantom with 9 lamps mounted along the aircraft's belly, paired with a specially formulated blue and white paint scheme designed to work alongside the lights rather than compete with them visually. It's a small irony worth noting. The very existence of a 1973 Air Force program built on this specific concept implies that someone, somewhere, still had access to the old Project Yehudi files, even while those files remained closed to the public. The idea hadn't been forgotten inside the military. It had simply been waiting for a threat environment where a 30% edge in detection range was worth the engineering cost of chasing it again. The results, when they came back, echoed the Avenger's 1945 test, almost exactly in shape, if not in scale. The lit aircraft reduced its visual detection range by roughly 30% compared to an unmodified Phantom under the same conditions. It wasn't the near-total disappearance the Avenger had managed against a slower, more predictable submarine lookout scenario. A fast jet in a dynamic engagement gave the system far less time to hold within its narrow effective angle. But a 30% reduction in detection range, in the kind of combat where seconds decided outcomes, was a meaningful number. And then, once again, the lights came off. The Air Force judged the operational complexity of maintaining and powering an active lamp system across a fighter fleet wasn't worth a 30% gain, particularly as other developments, radar-guided missiles, beyond visual range engagement doctrine, were already making pure visual detection a smaller piece of a much larger tactical picture. Compass Ghost's lamps were retired from the program without ever reaching squadron service, the same quiet fate that had met Project Yehudi's photocells nearly 30 years before. But this time, something did survive. The blue and white Compass Ghost paint scheme, developed specifically to work in concert with the lights, calibrated to blend with sky conditions the way Burr's original counter-illumination principle demanded, outlasted the lamps by decades. Variants of that gray-blue color family became standard for a wide range of U.S. fighter aircraft in the years that followed, and versions of it remain visible on American fighters flying today. A permanent piece of Air Force paint doctrine descended directly from a program built to make aircraft glow rather than hide. The active lighting system that inspired the color scheme was gone. The color scheme itself never really left. The idea Burr found by accident in 1940 hasn't stopped resurfacing since. In 2021, the defense contractor Bell Textron filed a patent later granted to Textron Innovations for what it called an active aircraft visual cloaking system. Onboard cameras reading the color of the sky or terrain around an aircraft in real time, and electroluminescent paint patterns activating to match it, adjusting continuously as the background changes. It isn't Yehudi's photocell and lamp hardware, and it wasn't developed by the Navy itself this time. It's worth being precise about that, since it's easy to blur a defense contractor's patent filing into "the military built this," and the distinction matters to getting the history right. But strip away 80 years of electronics, and the underlying instruction is the same one an NDRC engineer would have recognized instantly in 1943. Measure the sky behind you and become exactly as bright as it is. A camera reading ambient color and triggering electroluminescent paint is, functionally, a photocell and a lamp, with 80 more years of material science behind them. The same balancing act, Burr's photocell circuit, performed with vacuum tube-era electronics, now handled by a processor that can react faster and track far more subtle shifts in background color than any 1940s circuit ever could. That's the quiet thread running through this entire story, from a Canadian professor watching a plane vanish over snow, to a modified Avenger closing to 3,000 yards off the Atlantic coast, to 9 lamps under an F-4 Phantom over Vietnam, to a patent filed in the 21st century for an aircraft that reads its own background and disappears into it. None of these programs failed on their own terms. Each one proved, under real testing, that an aircraft could be made to vanish, not through darkness, not through stealth in the modern radar-evading sense, but through the much older and stranger trick of matching light itself. And each one was set aside anyway, not because the idea stopped working, but because the war, or the threat, or the technology around it moved somewhere. The idea no longer fit. There's a specific kind of persistence in that pattern that separates Project Yehudi from most abandoned wartime programs. Most shelved ideas from the 1940s stay shelved, replaced by better technology and eventually forgotten by everyone, except historians combing through declassified files. This one keeps getting rediscovered by people solving a slightly different version of the same problem, decades apart, often without direct knowledge of who solved it first. A Canadian professor watching snow reflect light onto an aircraft's underside. A Navy engineering team building photocell circuits for a torpedo bomber. An Air Force program testing belly-mounted lamps on a fighter jet in the middle of a very different war. A defense contractor, 60 years further on, filing paperwork for a camera and a sheet of electroluminescent paint. Different names, different decades, different aircraft entirely chasing the same 20 seconds, the same 30%, the same simple, stubborn idea that the sky itself is the best camouflage there is, if you can just learn to match it. 80 years after a plywood mock-up disappeared on the end of its own support cables, the U.S. military is still chasing the same result Burr found, by accident, an aircraft that isn't hidden in shadow, but hiding in plain, glowing sight. Project Yehudi was never made public while it might have mattered most. Some stories were never meant to be found. This one simply had to wait its turn.